thank you so much for talking to us. Congratulations on your research paper today at the Counter Narratives Conference of Mariwala Health Initiatives. Can you tell me briefly, summarize what you presented today? And so basically in brief points, what you presented today.
The research was primarily aimed at criticizing the dominant narratives that are there, which are basically the stage models of sexual identity formation, which explains that to be able to develop a sexual identity, I have to go from one stage to another and finally achieve the final goal, where the final goal is to be able to resolve my internal conflict which I'm experiencing and be out in more situations. So the first part of my study was to critique these models and then have a separate lens to understand how sexual identity works, which was a more social constructivist model which says that it is through social interactions that I have around me through which I'm able to develop my sexual identity, which also shifts the responsibility from me as an individual who's supposed to form a sexual identity to the society which is supposed to help me form that sexual identity.
Alright, thank you. You also talked about the idea of reflective appraisal. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So reflective appraisals is another concept which comes up from this social constructionist research paradigm, which says that reflective appraisals are basically my perception of how others around me see me, how others around me perceive me, and the feelings that result from it. So the kind of reflected appraisals an individual is exposed to in their environment has a significant impact on how they begin to see themselves and how they're able to navigate the formation of this sexual identity. It could be negative reflected appraisals in very subtle form, like one of my co-panelists was talking about microaggressions. So microaggression is a very significant yet very invisible form of negative reflected appraisals that we as individuals are exposed to and has a very detrimental impact on my journey in forming my sexual identity.
All right. And finally, you brought up a very interesting point. We in cities, like a city like Delhi or Bombay, we are used to this idea of gay people being, a particular kind. They're fashionable, they talk in a certain way. While outside of cities, where there's no exposure, there's no awareness, those standards don't exist. And so how do you think, say in rural areas, small towns of India, how are they negotiating sort of coming out with their identity, being comfortable with their identities?
I guess I would like to blame the social institutions that are around me to create this stereotype in the first place, that whenever we initiate a discussion around a homosexual individual, the first image that pops up in our mind is of an upper caste individual who's living in a metropolitan city, and I would blame for one media for it, because that is the source from which I'm deriving all these stereotypes, right? And various other social institutions for that matter. But that creates a very exclusive idea of how homosexuality works. It is not confined to urban spaces, it is prevalent everywhere. However, the question arises that how are people in the rural areas are able to navigate? I'm not sure. To be honest, it's very unfortunate that we are not aware of how they are able to navigate, because even the research that exists is confined to urban spaces. Because as in the morning, Deepa ma'am had spoken about the monopoly of research. So considering that monopoly of research, it is just confined to people who have the power of it, which is centered in these metropolitan cities, and it is not able to percolate to the rural areas. So we do not have much understanding, and I am not so sure how people are able to navigate with the kind of reflected appraisals they are exposed to, because I in the city still have some exposure to some positive reflected appraisals. For example, one or two movies that may have a decent representation of a queer individual, a story or two which might have a decent representation, so I still have something to hold on to. Such positive reflected appraisals may not be available to people in the rural areas, unfortunately. So it really then is a question mark that how are they able to navigate.
Thank you so much, Siddharth, and congratulations on your work.